here, but Mike stood up at the inaugural address at Gen Con and basically said, we're going to give D&D back to the players. Huge playtest, you're going to help to shape the future of the products. Give us a sense of the size, scale and scope of the project, how much playtesting's gone on, how much work's gone into what you've just done.
So the playtest, as far as we know, is the largest playtest that any tabletop game has ever had. Not just any role-playing game, any tabletop game, period. We had over 175,000 playtesters over the course of 2 years. And as you can see, if you've looked at the playtest packets over the last 2 years, there was a tremendous amount of evolution, even from the final playtest packet to what you see in the starter set and the player's handbook. In addition to that large body of playtesters in the public playtest, we also had a group of playtesters that we called our alpha playtesters. They signed non-disclosure agreements, and they were seeing material that even the public wasn't seeing. And that was over 100 groups, each group with 5 to 6 people. So that was then on top of the public playtest. And they were often giving us very rapid feedback on material that we would revise sometimes like every other week. So they were champs. Because we would sometimes revise a whole section of the game, send it out to the groups, and say, "We want feedback from you in 2 weeks," and they did it. What this meant for us was creating processes that we'd never had before. We've always incorporated playtesting into our work, but we had never incorporated playtesting to this scale before. And so the person who really took point on processing this insane amount of feedback was Peter Lee. Peter Lee is one of the designers of the board game Lords of Waterdeep, and he was the guy who was taking this line after line after line of feedback and sifting through every single line of it. And I like to bring that up because sometimes there's been skepticism. Oh, did Wizards actually go through all of this? Yes, actually, we did. It required a person working nearly full time for several months just on this, but it was worth it. It bore all sort of fruit for the game because it helped ensure that we really were listening to the thousands of people who love D&D. It also highlighted for us at times things that we thought we were going to need to change, but it turned out we didn't. There were things where we're not sure this is going to work. Oh, but everybody loves it. There were other times where we were confident. Oh, this is absolutely how this particular mechanic should be in the new game, and the playtesters showed us otherwise. So it was a very fruitful and dynamic process over those 2 years.
It feels to me like the game's gone back to its roots. Having played through the original edition, first, second, third, fourth, and now the new edition, it feels like the game's been has gone through a transformation. You've taken the best bits from each edition and effectively said, go and have a go with that. Is that about right?
Well, that's certainly been our goal, so it's gratifying if it seems that we've hit that goal. As we've said many times in talking about the new edition, our goal is to draw in all the treasures from the game's long history. And I guess another way I would put it is, rather than this edition being a reaction to the edition that came before it, or the most recent two, our goal was simply to make a great edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Because even D&D at times has engaged in almost sort of an edition war with itself, and we wanted no part of that anymore. We wanted simply to dive into our own legacy, which is vast and beloved, and draw on all the best aspects of that legacy. And I think you see that in what we've come out with so far.
What are some of the major changes between fourth edition and fifth edition? Some of the major things that you guys decided you needed to change, make sure to change, because that's the reaction you're getting.
So I would say one of the biggest changes, and it's a change that distinguishes the current edition from both 4th edition and 3rd edition, is we stopped mandating the use of miniatures. That might seem like a minor thing, but actually the decision, particularly in 3.5 and in 4th edition, to hard code the use of miniatures into the system had a ripple effect through the entire rule set. Simply by removing that requirement, that made it possible for us to have combat rules that are no longer than 10 pages. And you'll notice in the player's handbook that actually the playing the game portion of the book is the shortest portion. Because it meant that the rules overhead could be much lower. It also meant that we could provide a broader range of play options. We can still fully support the use of miniatures, because many people, including myself, love to use miniatures, but it means we can also make it so that if you want to have a D&D game around a campfire or in your living room lounging on your sofa, you can now do that again, which was possible in 1st and 2nd edition. And you could certainly do it with 3rd and 4th, but you were often sort of going against the grain of the rules expectations. And really that goes to the heart of our goal, is to get as many things out of the game that are going against how people want to play it. And we know D&D has such a huge audience that people have a vast array of ways they like to experience this game. I mean, some people like to experience it as a hardcore tactical miniatures game, and that's an awesome version of D&D. Other people on the other end of the spectrum like to experience it as an open-ended theater of the mind role-playing experience, and that's also an awesome version of D&D. And most groups we have found through the massive amount of data that we've collected fall somewhere in between those two extremes.
Okay. Just say a little more about the existence of more optional rules in this edition.
So there are optional rules already in the material we've released, like in the player's handbook, sprinkled all over the place. Now, some of them are flagged as optional rules. So in the player's handbook, you'll see multi-classing and feats are both optional rules. But we have also embedded this approach of options everywhere. That's why when you pick your class, for instance, you will invariably be presented with a really meaty choice. You're not only going to be a fighter, but you're going to be a champion, a battle master, or an eldritch knight. And each of those choices not only give you different features, but actually shape your game experience in a particular way. And that is another way that subtly we are trying to address this idea that people like to play D&D in different ways. That's why in the fighter, we have the champion, which is really meant to evoke the early edition fighter, and it's really there for the people that we discovered through the playtest. There are thousands of them, and this was actually, we weren't sure about this until we collected this massive amount of data. There are indeed many people who want to play a fighter, who just goes in there, has a ton of hit points, and hews off heads, and does so with very little fuss. We also know, though, that we have another group of our audience that wants a much more tactical experience, something more akin to what they would have experienced with, say, the 4th edition fighter, or with some of the options in 3rd edition. And so that's why we constructed the Battle Master, so that, again, in each of those cases, you're not only getting different features, the whole play experience is different. Okay. And we've expanded that also to the class design themselves, because you'll notice there's a lot of asymmetry among the classes, and that's intentional. We've made it so that when you pick a wizard versus a warlock, sure, you have some different spells to choose from, but the spellcasting methods themselves are different, because we want your class choice not only to be an aesthetic change and a story change, but the overall experience itself to feel different, so that you feel like, oh, in that next campaign, when I play a rogue instead of a barbarian, it will truly be a different experience.
Over the last couple of years, you guys have put on a lot of support to Drive-Thru RPG, a lot of old stuff. Are we going to continue to see that? Are we going to get new books that support more than one, like Minzo Bronson did? Are we going to see that across the board? Is D&D Insider going to keep the character generator for 4th edition?
So we will, as long as there are still old edition products for us to release in digital form, we will do so. People have loved dndclassics.com. I love it because there's a lot of old edition material that's fantastic. And as for the 4th edition character generator, our plan at this point is to keep it going. There's no reason for us to shut it down. There are many people who want to continue their 4th edition campaigns. And because our approach now is we are the shepherds of Dungeons and Dragons and not a particular edition, we are happy to support those people who want to keep playing 4th edition. I realize, going back actually to the previous question about options, one of the areas also where people will see a lot of new rules options is in the Dungeon Master's Guide. The Dungeon Master's Guide, which we're working on now actually, the Monster Manual is finished. Dungeon Master's Guide in many ways is in addition to having the usual guidance you would expect on creating an adventure and a campaign and being filled with magic items, also is kind of a kit basher's guide and has a lot of optional rules so that a dungeon master can fine-tune the experience. In some cases to emulate certain rules that were present in previous editions, but also in others to insert rules that are new to this edition.
Okay. So with all the previous, the history and the previous editions, you have all that experience behind you, and all the playtest experience and the alpha players that you've gathered data for 5th edition. What do you feel that you've learned, not just from them, but also from, I guess, other competition on the market? Has there been any research into that, and how did that help shape the experience in collecting data?
We always keep an eye on not only what other role-playing game publishers are doing, but also we always are keeping an eye on board games. We play especially fantasy role-playing game video games, particularly because so many of these other games are inspired by D&D.
Yeah.
So basically we like to see where the seeds planted in D&D, how they have grown in these other media. We're also all gamers, so we're constantly inspired by awesome designs we see elsewhere. Other than that, I mean, that's sort of the most we do is we play other people's games.
Yeah.
We read them. We also keep an eye on what's going on with the market. One of the surprising things, actually, speaking of the market, that we discovered in our playtest feedback process is when we would survey about the kinds of products people would like to see and the frequency of products, the message that came back is there is this desire to not see as many game mechanics. And so our goal long term is to keep sort of our grip on the amount of official game mechanics being released. Our grip is going to be pretty tight. Because people really want to see exciting adventures, they want to see inspiring stories, DMs want tools to create innovative campaigns, much more so than people want to see new rule upon new rule upon new rule.
Yeah. So then how do you keep the, the sense of structure that D&D founded, that culture of, structure within a role-playing game? How do you balance that out with, the sorts of free-form storytelling that has sort of evolved, that culture has evolved into?
Well, we do that largely by having a really solid core rule set. We've talked before about how important it is to us to have a base rule set that's simple, solid, and extensible. What we have found in our design is we could really have gone one of two ways with sort of the system, with that underlying structure. We could have gone very complex and tried to account for every corner case that might come up in a different campaign, or we could go very simple, create an extensible solid core that a DM could then riff on, or that other products could build on. And obviously we went with that second choice.
Okay.
Because the problem is if you build really large up front, it's actually much harder to take the material away than it is to add to it. Okay. So with this approach, we can, at a later date, if we want, create a very elaborate add-on with a far more complex set of rules, and that can rest on top of the foundation we've created. It'd be much more difficult if we created a very complex foundation and then try to basically take a bunch of it away.
Okay.
So you say that's similar to like the very, very early D&D where you went from D&D to expert, or to an advanced and then to expert. That's how you're looking at it now, to build that in different fashions.
And the thing is we're building that even in the core books, because you'll see even in a particular class, one choice over another, you've suddenly, like with the Battlemaster Fighter, you've actually added sort of a rules module on top of a really simple class. If you add multiclassing on, you've added an additional layer of complexity. If you add feats on, that's an additional layer of complexity. If you use the advanced grid, the use of the grid rules that we have in the Dungeon Master's Guide, well, you just added another layer. But again, because the core, simple, solid, extensible, it's not that difficult to layer on those options.
Could I ask about the three pillars? Exploration, interaction, combat. You look at the character sheet and it's very noticeable to people who've played other editions that on the right hand side you've got the personality traits, the bonds, the flaws, and you've basically said, look, role playing is key to this edition. If you want inspiration points, you've got to tick these boxes. How important is role playing in Dungeons and Dragons? Because it felt to me like 4th edition was basically a war game at times. You had so many powers and combat was interminable, it took forever. But now combat's very quick. You can go whole sessions without rolling a dice. And I think that feels more like the pure D&D that I grew up with. So how important is role playing to the new edition?
It's vital, because D&D at its heart is a storytelling game, where everyone at the table is a collaborator in the creation of a story. We felt it was important to embrace role-playing and embrace it in a very prominent way, not only on things like the character sheet, but also in the amount of pages we devoted in the player's handbook to personalities and backgrounds, partly to sort of wave the flag of storytelling and role-playing, but also because, honestly, if a group isn't into a lot of storytelling and role-playing, if they really just do want more of sort of a tactical, fight monsters experience, it is much easier for them to ignore the role-playing material than it is for us to have a game that is serving just the tactical play and then try to make it clear that it's still a role-playing game.
Okay.